like to start off by thanking everyone for being here. This is a little interesting since I'm now debating my former coach, so that's always fun. We've got the resolution today is that it is time to legalize marijuana, and we all know what those words mean, so just a quick bit of analysis. What we're going to be talking about right now is that it's a good idea to legalize marijuana in the United States for recreational use. Of course, this would be subject to reasonable regulations such as taxes similar to on cigarettes and alcohol, as well as laws regarding the use of that, such as with driving or anything else that is ruled to be a public danger. So I'm not saying it should just be legalized, no restrictions, but we should reverse the current status of making it illegal for regulation or for recreational use. Now, since legality is not directly based on the effects of it, like for instance, the government doesn't regulate everything or doesn't ban everything that's harmful to you. What the weighing mechanism today is going to be benefit to rights. Essentially, my opponent is going to have to prove to you how the banning this is going to result in more rights based on the harmful effects that generally the legislation is based on right now. So with that said, let's go to my first contention. By the way, the framework for this case is I'm going to be providing some of the benefits to legalization of these. My opponent's going to have to get up here and show you why the negative effects are going to outweigh these, which hopefully is not going to be able to do. The first contention is going to be health benefits. According to the Journal of American Medical Association, it does not impair lung function and, in fact, increases lung capacity. They tested, let's see, what's that number? 75,000 people. No, that's not. Over 5,000 people. Not a 7. Over 5,000 people for over 20 years and found that pot smokers, on average, were healthier than tobacco smokers and experienced several beneficial effects, such as increased lung capacity. According to the California Pacific Medical Center, it can stop cancer from spreading. It also results in a lot of other benign medical effects. It can prevent blindness from glaucoma, help hepatitis treatment, reduce pain, stop Alzheimer's, cure epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, lots of beneficial effects. So the point is, I'm not saying, clearly this round is not about medical use. However, if we allow the general public to do this, there will be health benefits that will result from that. And those have to be weighed against the health costs, which apparently my opponent will bring up. Let's go to my second contention, which is basically the economic effects of this. According to Business Week, this, if the government legalized and taxed it in a similar way to alcohol or tobacco, they could expect to make between $40 and $100 billion per year off of tax revenue. This is about approximately the same amount that criminals currently make from the sale of this, because it's the extra costs in addition to the manufacture. So basically we can see from this is not only would the government be getting a significant source of revenue, but also that same amount of money would be denied to the criminal gangs that currently distribute this. So you can see that the criminals would be getting less money and the government would be getting more money, which is a good thing for society. Also, according to the National Research Council, they did a study which found that criminalization does not reduce crime, and the world does not reduce the amount of use. The World Health Organization talks about the Netherlands, where marijuana smoking is legal. They actually use it less than they currently do in the United States, which would go further to indicate that criminalizing it doesn't reduce use. So this debate is not about determining the use; it's about the legality of it. My final contention is going to be about the criminal justice system. According to CNN, in 1 year alone, 50,000 people were arrested for possession of marijuana in New York City alone. This cost the city $75 million, and this is just one city in the United States. According to the FBI, since 1995, over 12 million people have been arrested for marijuana-related infractions. 80% of these were possession, not for dealing or anything else illegal like that. So that this number is actually more than all violent crimes combined. So more people are arrested for marijuana offenses than for all violent crimes combined. This is a huge chunk of money that is going to enforce these right now. And when there's at best ambiguous evidence regarding the problems with smoking marijuana, you can see how it's clearly more beneficial to legalize this rather than make it criminal and continue to incur the costs that go along with that. Also, according to the Department of Health and Human Services, around 100 million Americans have smoked marijuana at one point in their lives, roughly a third of the population of the United States. This means that you're making something illegal that at one point in time, about a third of the population of the United States have engaged in. So clearly people don't think that this is such a big problem. And if it were so bad for your health and everything, we would see people dropping dead, by thousands, which obviously we don't. So for these reasons, because it's going to result in health benefits, economic benefits, and benefits to the criminal justice system. I strongly urge you to vote for ballot. Thanks.
You ready?
Yep.
Okay. Your weighting mechanism was benefit to rights, correct?
Yes.
Fantastic. How do any of your contingents relate to rights? What rights are implicated?
Well, basically, you should have the right to do anything you want unless it's proven to be harmful. So the government, the starting assumption is not that the government, bans everything.
Where does this basis come from that we have the right to do whatever we want to? Where in the Constitution does it say that?
It doesn't say that in the Constitution.
Okay,
it's just
so
an easily achievable principle.
So the whole concept of benefiting to rights also has to base off this idea that we're free to do whatever we want, but that's not in the Constitution Bill of Rights, correct?
Well, basically, I'm not saying that you're free to do whatever you want necessarily. I'm saying that the default state of any good is that it should not be banned from the government. Like the government shouldn't ban everything.
So you're making the assumption then that these rights exist, but you have no document to back this up.
I'm not saying that
no philosopher to back
I'm
this
saying
up.
that let's say before government, the government comes into the picture. It's not like they ban everything and they legalize it based on the benefits.
Right.
They say, well, you can do this because the benefits outweigh the cost.
Okay.
It's the other way around. You have to
Now,
prove the harm.
The health benefits, you talked about, who did the study that showed the no lung harm?
That was the Journal of the American Medical
And there's no lung harm at all, you're saying? So breathing in smoke doesn't harm your lungs if it's marijuana.
Well, two things. Number one, they found it's better for you than tobacco. Number two, whereas tobacco use makes your lung capacity go down, smoking pot actually increases your lung capacity.
The question is, did you or did you not say there was no harm to the lungs?
I didn't say there was no harm to the lungs.
Okay. You said it did not impair lung function, correct?
I said it improved lung capacity.
But does it impair lung function?
That would be, I guess.
One last thing, are you proposing a plan here, a policy of some sort?
Not precisely.
Are kids going to be able to use this under your affirmation?
I said that there would be reasonable regulations.
Which
based
are,
on similar
will
to
that,
alcohol or
okay.
tobacco. An age restriction is probably one of the ones that they would use.
First and foremost, I do want to thank everybody for being here today. As Tim said, last year I wasn't scoped at Sam Houston. Unfortunately, I'm not still there, but I do maintain close ties with the group. And much as we've had fun in practice rounds, Tim has always said he wanted to debate me in front of a judge, so we finally get to do it. Because we didn't get to do it at Shreveport because I had to catch a flight. So thank you for being here. Thank you for taking notes. I see you with the laptops on it, and I think you're taking copious notes. I really look forward to reading those. That being said, what I'm going to do now is go straight down the on case and then the off case, and it'll give you some arguments independently, even if our affirmative said nothing, why you would want to negate the resolution. First of all, let's look at this idea of what he set out here. He says, well, I'm not really proposing a plan, I'm saying reasonable restrictions. The problem with doing this is when you propose you take an action, as the affirmative, his burden of proof is to tell exactly what he's doing. Otherwise, he can essentially become a moving target. At the point where he doesn't do this, he hasn't really even met his prima facie burden here. When he says it's time to take an action, even if he's not proposing a policy, he should at least tell us what the action is. For instance, I had to ask him to say, can kids use these? These like similar to alcohol, tobacco, policies. So is it 18? Is it 21? Who is it? So regardless of that, he also then gives this weighing mechanism. The criteria is you or the judge of benefit to rights. The problem is he never links any of his contentions directly to rights, except for this idea, this libertarianism thing, where basically a man has the right to do whatever he wants so long as he's not harming anybody else. One, he gives you no actual analysis on this in case. CX is not constructed time, so he's not actually making an argument here, so there is no actual link to rights in the first place. Secondly, he assumes these rights exist and gives you no warning as to why to accept them in the first place, because they're very legal philosophies. Only really libertarianism accepts this principle that man can do whatever. So the point where he gives you no justification to accept this, you can see, even by his own weighing mechanism, he doesn't survive here. Looking first to the idea of health benefits. I have him, he wrote down, and I hope you wrote it down too, where he says it does not impair lung function. I got him on this in CX because clearly smoking anything is going to impair lung function. Now he has a study, I have a study, specifically saying that it's actually much more harmful than tobacco. This was done by the University of Delaware in 2008. Specifically what it looked at, and I'll get into this morning off cases, it says it's 4 times more harmful because it has more tar, primarily because marijuana cigarettes, unlike most Marlboros for instance, aren't filtered. So at that point you have no filter stopping the tar from getting into your lungs. More importantly, he gives you no causation here. At the very best, his study only proves correlation that, okay, marijuana people have improved lung function. He has no warrant as to why this is true. Then to the idea of preventing cancer, glaucoma, these are nonsensical arguments only for the purpose that he's not advocating medical marijuana. And unless he's advocating that people self-medicate using recreational drugs, which is inherently a dangerous thing to do in the first place, because you can even die from using Tylenol, we see we're not going to gain any of these medical benefits. To the second point, this idea of, we're going to gain all this money off taxes. The fact is, gaining money off taxes is not a justification to do something. More importantly, causing people to pay more taxes would inherently violate his idea of being able to be in a free, unrestricted state. Because if you look at most libertarians, they oppose the high taxes. Why? Because the more, the power to tax is the power to destroy. At the point where he's actually increasing the number of taxes paid by people, he's increasing government control, which actually hurts people's rights. Furthermore, he said that the criminal enterprises right now are making $100 million, and then we can make $100 million in taxes. The only way for him to do this is to double the price. Because if the criminal people are not, when you buy marijuana now, you pay no taxes on it. So if the criminal people make $100 million now, and for the government to make that $100 million, you have to pay twice as much for the marijuana, which is inherently going to be bad, and therefore his stats are going to fall because people aren't going to buy as much. So really that number would be about cut in half. Then he has this idea of criminalization does not reduce use. He has a study with that. I have a counter study from when we actually legalized it in the United States and Alaska from 1978 to 1994, which actually saw much increased use. Then he gives this idea of the Netherlands uses less. What Tim doesn't mention to you is that every drug is legal in the Netherlands. You can do cocaine, you can do crack, you can do heroin, you can do ecstasy. So with all these other drugs legal, of course marijuana use is going to be less because people have many more options. So the point where this happens, it's not a correlation to the fact that legalization makes you do less, unless Tim is advocating that we actually legalize all these drugs, which have inherent harms to that. The third point, the criminal justice thing. He says more people are arrested for marijuana crimes, which is true, than all violent crimes combined. However, this is not solved necessarily by legalization. You can simply solve this by decriminalization, as we did in the 1970s, and make it a ticketable offense, give people a fine just like a speeding ticket. That way you take the burden off the criminal justice system, people simply pay a fine to do it. Remember, as the negative, I don't have to advocate that we keep the status quo. I can say anything as long as I cast reasonable doubt. He can only advocate legalization, so we can solve this without what he's doing. Then to the idea of, 100 million people smoked at one point. Again, he says at one point, these are not regular users. People do a lot of stupid things with their kids, it doesn't mean we should legalize it. Getting to the off case, the first problem in why it violates people's rights is the right to safety. With alcohol, we have things called breathalyzers. So if you're pulled over, they can tell exactly how drunk you are. According to the National Academy of Sciences, no similar technology exists for marijuana, so there's no way to tell exactly how inebriated on marijuana you were. Also, according to that same study, the combination of being high and drunk at the same time makes a person much more likely to commit offense or to get car wrecks. Secondly, health risks. I already referenced this study, but 4 times this was also National Academy of Sciences. Marijuana, according to the same study, accounted for 290,000 yearly visits to the ER. And also in Alaska, it doubled use, especially among children, because when it's more accessible to adults, it's certainly more accessible to children. Thank you.
Okay. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Just got a couple quick questions. First, your last point, I believe, I didn't quite feel that, your off-case convention.
The increase in use. Specifically, there was, when Alaska specifically legalized it from 1978 to 1994, what they saw is their population use doubled in marijuana. Specifically, they saw increased use among children because when adults can legally obtain this, it was a lot easier for the kids to get it, much in the same way that kids today abuse prescription drugs that their parents have.
Did they tax it, similar to alcohol or tobacco?
The source I had specifically only mentioned the usage. I don't know if they taxed it.
Okay.
I would imagine they did it. At the very least, there's sales tax.
Okay. Now, you talked about how basically smoking anything is going to impair lung use, right?
Yeah, that's the idea, especially smoking something unfiltered as people do with marijuana.
Now, would you advocate banning tobacco?
Banning tobacco? Not particularly, however, tobacco is 4 times less likely to harm you, according to
Okay.
National Academy of Sciences.
Now, is that per cigarette and joint? Or is that-
One joint is 4 times more harmful than one
Okay.
cigarette.
Do people generally chain smoke joints?
The people I knew in college did. In fact, they would actually have a bowl.
Do you know anything about actual use as far as, on average, how many people smoke as much marijuana as they smoke cigarettes?
I don't know that we've ever had a chance really, maybe in Alaska, but I don't know if studies really came out of that.
Okay. Now, you talk about how basically we could change this to a fine, we could basically institute a fine rather than legalizing it completely. Why would this be better?
Inherently, what we're going to do there is we're going to solve for the cost of the criminal justice system, because when you're ticketing people, because the costs associated with that primarily are jailing these people, putting these people in prison, because it costs a lot of money to put a person in prison. So at the point where it's just a fine, not a jailable offense, we cut down there.
Okay. Alright, I have a lot to cover, so I'm going to jump right into it. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how I have to prove a specific policy rather than just a general thing. First of all, the legalization of marijuana, as with pretty much anything, is going to involve changes during implementation. They're going to propose a policy based on trial and error. They're going to make changes to it. The drinking age has changed in the past because, when you implement a policy, it's not necessarily perfect right off the bat. I'm advocating the idea rather than a specific change. Next, he talks about how basically I never link this to rights and provide no justification for this. I did tell you why the government, the government doesn't ban everything and then legalize certain things. You knew this already, I didn't have to say it. The government only bans things that are harmful. Next, he talks about how basically smoking anything is going to hurt your lungs. However, they found that smoking pot is actually better for your lungs than tobacco. Now he talks about how, it's basically 4 times as harmful to smoke a joint versus a cigarette. However, this is looking at 1 cigarette versus 1 joint. When they look at actual use, as in the study of 75,000 people over 20 years, they found that the people who smoke marijuana experience benefits compared to people who smoke tobacco. I can only assume that if my opponent's evidence is correct, this means that they smoke less marijuana than the people who smoked cigarettes did. So as a result, you can still see that it's more beneficial than tobacco because you don't smoke as much of it. Next, he talks about how basically the medical use doesn't factor into the debate. However, these benefits are going to happen regardless of the reason people are smoking them. For instance, it blocks the spread of cancer. If you have undiagnosed cancer, that's still a benefit, and you weigh that against the cost my opponent talked about. Next, he talks about how basically it's violating the principle of rights to put this tax on it. However, increasing the price via taxes is still less of a burden on the people than it is an outright ban. So you can see it's clearly advancing the cause of rights to legalize this, even if there are still regulations. He talks about how it's going to double the price. The evidence from Business Week actually said that the government would be able to make revenue in the same way criminal enterprises do now. It would not double the price. He talks about how in the Netherlands, every drug is legal, so you can't take this. However, that's only attacking one of the studies I brought up. The other one, I'm not exactly sure what the methodology they used was, but they determined that the criminalization of marijuana had no effect on use. Next, he talks about how basically, just because a bunch of people smoke it doesn't mean, in fact, he talks about the change to the fine. Basically, he says, if we just fine people, that would be better than, legalizing it entirely. However, if a fine is basically, the people under my system, people would still be fined for using it in ways that hurt society. For instance, if you're driving while intoxicated, he says, well, you can't measure that. But if someone's driving recklessly and they're found to have marijuana in their system, you can still get them on that. You don't need to know exactly how much is in their system in order to fine them based on that. And the point here is that there's no reason to ban it if they're not using it poorly. And he talks finally about how it increased use. However, there are other factors in Alaska, including the fact that it's remote, and we have no evidence on whether or not they tax it or regulate it. For these reasons, I urge an affirmative ballot. Thanks.
Everybody? Good?
Yep.
Once again, do want to thank you guys for being here today. That said, we have a lot to talk about, not a lot of paper, not a lot of time, so let's get directly into it. Go down basically what he said and give you voters throughout. The first issue is this idea of a prima facie burden. The problem here is that he never really answers this argument. He says, well, it's going to be the idea it's going to change over time. So right there, he admits what he's advocating is a moving target. At the point where it's a moving target, becomes inherently hard for the negative to attack it, because every time I attack it, he can simply shift out of it. Not saying he would do that, but I'm simply saying he could, and his prima facie burden is to lay his entire case in his affirmative, which he simply did not do, at the point where I had to actually ask him in CX about whether or not kids could use it. Secondly, this whole concept of linking to rights. The fact is, his constructive is the time, not his CX time, for him to make arguments. At the point in his actual case where he does not link to rights, does not show you this, he does not meet his own weighing mechanism. He says, I don't have to tell you, you already know this. Well, if you already know this, then you should have circled the ballot long before we got here, because we wouldn't have to debate in the first place. But if we're going to judge solely on the round, he simply did not meet prima facie burden when he did that. So at the point where he doesn't link to his own weighing mechanism, he simply cannot win, because the weighing mechanism is a criterion. It's a way for you to judge the round. It's the way he asked you to judge the round. And I ask that you do that. Show that he didn't link to it, so therefore he can't meet his burden. Third, he says, well, they don't smoke as much. Yeah, because if it's so harmful, but for the two studies to work together, one, I contend his study is probably wrong. The fact that what we see here is my study shows it's 4 times as harmful. He goes, oh, these probably smoke less. Look at my study as far as Alaska, which shows that we actually increase the amount of people who are smoking. Furthermore, the implication is there, as long as we're just making guesses about this, the fact is marijuana is still illegal in this country, so you can't smoke it as openly. I admit I'm a smoker, and on a campus that allows smoking, I smoke a lot. But if I smoke marijuana, there's no way I'd be smoking on a campus, because obviously it's illegal. So it is, when you do legalize it, as with Alaska, it's going to increase use. So its harms are going to duplicate with that. Then we talked about the idea of increasing taxes. Now, specifically what my opponent said was the government would make 40 to 100 million, which is what criminals are making. Then he says, oh no, they're just going to make it in the same way. I hope you wrote down what he said, because that is what he said. He specifically advocated this idea that they would make the same amount. One increases taxes, but in order to make the same amount, the tax would have to equal to the price, so it's going to double the price. More importantly, power to tax is the power to destroy. Then this whole concept of using a fine, he goes, well, we'd still fine people for whatever, but the point here is that by fining them, by decriminalizing it, by making it like a traffic ticket, I'm eliminating all the costs for the criminal justice system without advocating the resolution, leaving you no reason for criminal justice to advocate, which means criminal justice is no longer a voter for him. Then we look at this idea, he says, and this becomes very, very important to rights. Now, he said this in his last speech as a rebuttal, the first time I get to respond to it, but he says, if they have marijuana in their system and they get pulled over for reckless driving, we're going to punish them for being intoxicated under marijuana. The problem is, as I said, marijuana, whether I smoke it today or 30 days from now, will register the exact same level. And what that does, remember the weighing mechanism is the people's rights, that violates the right to due process. The fact is, if they're not under the influence at the time, which we can't tell because we don't have the technology, then you would violate the rights by punishing them for smoking 2 days, 10 days, 30 days ago when they're not actually intoxicated, but you're going to charge them because you heard what Tim said about punishing them for having it in their system when they're misusing it. So at that point, we're seeing a major rights violation because people's due process rights are being violated because they're being charged with something they didn't actually do, rather than the court or the police can't prove they did. So at that point, we see this is also a major reason to reject legalization, because until the technology exists, because if I'm drunk and I'm driving and I take a breathalyzer, it can tell me 0.07, 0.08, point whatever, and tell me exactly how drunk I am. There's a legal standard. We can't have that for marijuana because we cannot test exactly how much is in their system. Then we look to the other points with this. We see the health risks. The fact is there are health risks to this. There are health risks to smoking anything. What he drops is the analysis that 290,000 ER visits happen per year related to marijuana. This is a very significant number. And we also see the fact that it's going to happen with kids. He never really addresses their taxes. The fact is, when you make this available, not only is it going to increase use like in Alaska, but it's going to increase the use with kids who shouldn't be getting it, just like they get in the mom and dad's prescription cabinet. Now they're going to be smoking mom and dad's weed. At the point where we see this, we see negative, harmful effects, and we don't really know what it does to children. So we see a violation of their rights as well as parents' rights going as well. So for all these reasons, what we see here, if you're looking away this on rights, we see the real violation of rights comes through legalization, comes through due process violation, comes through medical harms, and all the things I talked about. Thank you. Let me see here. Everybody ready?
Once again, I have a lot to cover, so the first thing my opponent talks about is how I'm still advocating this moving target, not something you can clearly go against. However, that's just real life. When we're talking about a general principle, which is what the resolution calls for, I can't tell you exactly what's going to be implemented. When people, put restrictions on the age at which you can purchase alcohol, that wasn't the policy that they ended up with. They ended up changing it several times to ensure that they had the best system. That's real life. That's how the world works. I'm advocating a principle, not a specific age in which they can't buy it. Next, he talks about how basically I talked about rights and CX and not in my speech. However, I think, and he says that I claimed you should already know that, what I talked about. I think he was referring to the entire case. What I said you should already know is that the government only bans things when they're harmful. It doesn't, ban everything and then legalize the good things. That's not how it works. If you didn't already know that, by all means, vote for my vote. Next thing he talks about is basically, the fact that you contest my idea about how you don't smoke as much marijuana versus tobacco. What the study found, which is, I talked about the methodology for the study, it was very good methodology. They studied over 5,000 people over 20 years. It's a very well-done study. They found that it's better for you than if you smoked tobacco. That's what I'd like to leave you with. It talks about in Alaska, how it increased use. One thing I did talk about in Alaska is, it's very remote. Like they'd have to fly the marijuana in. It's kind of a different situation than, or places where it's already legally available. Then the other thing I talked about is taxes. You never once talked about taxes. If you have a problem where too many people are using it and it's becoming, everybody's on marijuana, you can raise taxes. That's what I talked about under implementation. If there's a problem with your policy, you can change it in order to make it better. That doesn't deny the principle as a whole. He talks about how it's going to double the price. I already talked about how the Business Week article said that it wouldn't double the price. It would just change the revenue from the criminals to the government, which is a benefit. Doubling the price doesn't really make sense to me. Then he talks about how basically this fine would be a better system. However, there's no reason to penalize people for possession. He never once gives you that. Like I said, out of the 12 million people arrested for pot-related offenses, 80% of them were arrested, just for possession. Fining these people for possession doesn't make any sense either. It doesn't make any sense to punish them unless they were doing something that hurts other people. He talks about, how due process, how it's going to violate due process. Once again, this is an implementation issue. But if you are driving recklessly, it doesn't really matter exactly, how much you have in your system. You clearly couldn't handle it. If you're driving recklessly, that's currently an offense that you can be charged for. It's not violating your due process. And finally, he talks about the health risks. There are greater health risks for tobacco according to the study. My opponent is a smoker. I don't think he would like it if we banned tobacco. And if pot has less health risks, there's certainly no reason to ban that. And for these reasons, because there is no justification for banning it, you should have the right to do it because there is an absence of significant harm. I strongly urge you to burn it. Thanks.